Oscar Pistorius' hopes of being home by Christmas have been crushed. The Supreme Court of Appeal has cleared up the confusion regarding the time he spent in jail following the various appeals and orders that had been issued. And Tania Koen, who is Steenkamp's spokesperson and, of course, their attorney, will be joining us in just a moment to talk about this and understand just their reaction and where things stand right now and what happens next, because we do understand that the eligibility will be next year. And I do understand that Tania is with us right now. Tania, thank you so much for your time. It's Bongiwe. Let's talk about the confusion. How did it come about?
All right. Good evening and thank you for having me. So, on the 24th of November 2017, the Supreme Court of Appeal delivered their judgment after the matter had been referred back to them when the trial court only sentenced Oscar Pistorius to 6 years for murder. The court then decided that there was no substantial and compelling circumstances which allowed them to deviate from the minimum prescribed sentence, which was 15 years. But because Oscar had already served a period of 12 months and 7 years, 12 months imprisonment and 7 months correctional supervision, the court decided that they would take that time served into account and then impose a sentence of imprisonment of 13 years and 5 months. What subsequently happened, I believe, is that Mr. Julian Knight, who is Oscar's attorney, wrote to the Supreme Court of Appeal and asked for some clarity on the matter. And a directive was then issued by the court which stated that the sentence was antedated to the date on which Judge Masipa had originally sentenced or imposed the sentence on Oscar Pistorius, which was then in July 2016. And then to further complicate matters, a couple of months later, a further directive was issued by the court which said, wait a moment, that sentence must actually be antedated to 2014, which was the date when Oscar Pistorius was initially sentenced for culpable homicide. And that's when the confusion arose as to when does he now become eligible for parole. It's always been our view, my apologies.
No problem, Tania, continue.
It's always been our view that the Supreme Court of Appeal's decision in November 2017 was unambiguous and very clear, and that's the date from which the sentencing should run, because the court specifically stated that they had taken into account the time already served.
So what happens now then, Tania, in your understanding as, the legal parties that are involved here?
Right, so because of the directive about 2 weeks ago, which from the Supreme Court of Appeal, which stated quite clearly that the decision made by the Supreme Court of Appeal in November 2017 is indeed the correct one, and that the subsequent amendments had just disregarded the law or the facts. That is the date that stands. So that means that from that date, from 24 November 2017, from that date, Oscar Pistorius must serve half of his sentence for him to become eligible to be considered for placement on parole. So the next step would be, during the course of next year, when he has served half his sentence, it would mean that the parole board will convene. The parole board will then inform the victims, or in this case, the victim's family, June and Barry, that the parole board will convene on a certain date, and they have to give us 30 days notice. And we are then afforded the opportunity to either personally appear or make written representations which will be considered by the parole board.
And those representations or a personal appearance, how much weight does it then have when it comes to the decision that then gets made?
It's only one of the factors that the parole board will take into account. There's many other factors that are taken into account. And yes, the victim's family does have it does carry a certain amount of weight, but not all the weight.
And I'm certain that this latest development around this particular matter has had some kind of reaction or response from June and Barry. What have they said? You know, how do they feel about the latest developments?
You know, it's as anybody can understand, it's a very traumatic situation for them, and it's constantly in the media, and the wounds that has never really healed, it's constantly being opened. For them, the fact that there's now clarity does give them some form of relief, because they now know what is in store for them, what the next step is. Whereas when the matter was not clarified, you know, they constantly wondered and would inquire, you know, what's going to happen, when is he eligible, because nobody really knew.
And are they prepared for the possibility of his release?
It's part of my job to prepare my clients, so I have prepared them quite well, I think, because this is our law. Our law states that any offender who has served a certain amount of time is eligible to be considered for placement on parole. What the parole board will decide, obviously I cannot comment on that, but in all likelihood, the parole board will place Oscar Pistorius on parole the same way they have placed other offenders on parole, obviously under certain conditions.
And as a final question then, I mean, when one watches the documentary where, you know, they're speaking, you can tell that it's really still a very difficult journey for them. How has it been thus far? You know, obviously losing a child is something that is very difficult.
Yes, it is very difficult. And I always say that, you know, a lot of people will say to them, it's time to get over it, which I think is very harsh, and because they have got over the loss of their daughter or their son or their child. But everybody grieves in their own manner, and the fact remains that they lost their daughter in a horrendous way. So it's always with them, the way that she died. They miss her every day, every holiday, every birthday. It's traumatic for them, and you know, the fact that next year will be 10 years has not made it any easier for them. In fact, they miss her even more.
Tania, thank you so much for your time. Do appreciate it this evening. We do appreciate you taking our call. That was the Steenkamp spokesperson, as well as their attorney, Tania Koen, who was, of course, joining us to talk about the latest development around the Oscar Pistorius matter.